Hi everyone, and welcome to the Career Discovery Sessions, an initiative that helps students like you and me who may or may not struggle with finding their professional focus in the world by speaking to inspiring individuals about their career choices and their opportunities they took to be in the places where they are now. Today, we proudly present Rob Williams, the CEO of War Child UK, a charity organisation who aims to protect, educate, and support and stand up for the rights of children affected by warfare. Nice to see you today, Rob.
Great. Yeah, and thanks for having me.
No problem. Well, I want to begin by asking you a little bit about your education. What degree did you finish?
I did A levels in English, history, and French because I thought they were the most interesting subjects. And I had one big idea when I applied for uni, which was why not try and go for the best? And my second big idea was I'd like to study a subject that probably no one else has studied before they get to university. So I'm not going to find myself surrounded by people who have become experts in something already. And I chose to do law because you couldn't do law A level at that stage. So I thought, at least on day one, everyone's going to be in the same situation, right? None of us know anything about law. I also wanted to be a barrister. I wanted to earn quite a lot of money by standing in a courtroom being clever. And so I got a place at Oxford to study law. And it was all looking like that was a good first step to being a lawyer.
Definitely.
Yeah, but I really wanted a gap year. I wanted to travel and I had no money. So I wrote letters to lots of charities who had projects anywhere that wasn't the United Kingdom. And I said, do you want a volunteer? I must have sent, I don't know, about 25 letters. And generally they didn't reply. Some said no, but Save the Children said yes. They were running a school for children with disabilities in Morocco, and they needed a volunteer to provide some extracurricular entertainment. So I said yes to that. And I got on I bought one of those Eurotrain tickets where you get to travel, Interrail tickets. Traveled around Europe after my A levels, ended up in Morocco, and walked the last 3 miles to this incredible school in the middle of a rural part of Morocco, full of children aged between 8 and 18 who had all had, mostly they'd had polio. They couldn't walk. They were in iron calipers or wheelchairs. But they were hilariously funny and really sharply clever. And I spent a year running art classes, which is hilarious because I can't draw. And there was even a tiny little pool, like a therapy pool, and we turned it into a kind of a great place to play volleyball. We had crutch football games. I opened a little sweet shop where I kind of handed out sweets without selling them. And I just had the best time. And by the end of my gap year, I realized that I didn't really want to be a lawyer. I wanted to spend my life working in that kind of environment. For an aid agency, basically, I couldn't see any downsides to it whatsoever because the work was interesting. The people I worked with were really nice. The children were just hilarious, and also you get to live in someone else's culture. That was amazing. Like I learned Arabic. I found out all about Moroccan food. So yeah, I ended up at uni doing a degree I didn't really need, but I knew I needed a degree of something, and law was fascinating. And you couldn't really study international development then. So, I had a really good time. But my problem was, as soon as I graduated, I had to answer this question: how on earth do you get a job as an aid worker if you're not a doctor or an engineer? So yeah, but I kind of left university with a definite view as to what I wanted to end up doing.
Right. So you spoke about your work experience. Obviously, the gap year was very life-changing for you. So where did you go after that? What were your first experiences? How did you find your way to an aid agency?
Well, so I leave Oxford, I go to London, and I got a job. What was my first job? My first job was phoning people up, asking them if they wanted to buy a hospitality suite at Wimbledon. I was basically marketing, and I was doing that because I needed some money and then some time to get a job with an aid agency. And I went back to my trusted method, which was to write letters to everybody. I used to go to the library in my lunch break and write 2 letters. I had a huge list of charities who worked overseas, and I gradually went down the list. And eventually the Red Cross replied and said, we haven't got a job overseas, but you could work in the London office where we needed administrative assistant. And I was really delighted. So I ended up working in this huge office, doing things that really you don't need to do these days, like typing and answering lots of strange letters that came to us from Red Cross members, and saving up my money so that I could go and have beer with the people who worked in the room next to mine, which was like the international room, where they looked after the projects they were running overseas. And after a year of that, I had my lucky break. I was asked if I would go and do the administrative job for a project they were starting in Uganda. And the project was to create a small workshop with about 30 staff where we would make the kind of equipment that I'd seen the children using in Morocco. Uganda had had a civil war. It had huge numbers of amputees and disabled people, and they just didn't have wheelchairs or calipers. We ended up making a lot of false legs for people so that they could move around again. And that was my break. It was my first paid job in aid, and I think I was lucky, definitely, but I made my own luck by putting myself into that situation. You know, I had a job. It wasn't a job that I wanted, but it was in a charity, and I just talked to everybody until they gave me a job overseas. So when people ask me, I get lots of emails now from people asking me how they can get a job in aid. And my first piece of advice is always, you need to put yourself in a situation where you are exposed to your lucky break. And that normally means getting a job in a charity, whatever job it is. If you want to work in a charity, just go there and, I don't know, clean the toilets for a while, just make friends with people. Or if you really want to work for a charity that does emergency work, you could do a lot worse than travel to a country where there is a humanitarian disaster and volunteer. Just turn up to Save the Children or War Child and say, is there anything I can do to help? And if you're good and helpful, then that might develop into a job at some stage.
So I can see that networking and communicating with people is a really important aspect of a person who wants to go into this job role. Do you think there is another personality type that fits a job role, or is there a specific one, or is it quite open?
Well, my sector is really interesting because you need almost every different type of person. I've ended up in a kind of management role where I have to use a lot of communication and an awful lot of kind of forward planning and forward thinking. My job's basically to think about what War Child should look like in 5 years' time and put everything in place for us to make that journey. But in the organization, we have security people who come often from a military background, and their job is to be aware of the conflict and what's happening and which roads are safe and which are not safe. So they need quite a lot of attention to detail. Then we have some really technical people, like our education department has some amazingly skilled teachers and thinkers about how you use digital technology to provide education in a place where there isn't a school. And then, of course, we have accountants and we have HR people. So across the whole organization, there are plenty of people who contribute, not by talking and networking, but by actually being really good at detail.
Wow, sounds great. I'm going to take you back to what you said about what you do as a CEO. So you said you plan the 5-year plan for the organization, but what does your day-to-day look like? What do you wake up and you do what?
Not well, right now I wake up and come into this room and I spend my day on Zoom meetings. But well, let's say a typical day would be spending some time just answering emails, but quite a big chunk of time organizing the process by which we think about what we're going to do next. So right now, we have a big project to figure out what we do to respond to Black Lives Matter. So there is a debate in the aid world right now that says it looks an awful lot like white people have lots of money and they're doing projects in countries where people are much poorer, and it's the white people who are making all the decisions about what should happen. And there are many, many ways in which you can move on from that situation. One of them is to not use all the money that you're raising yourself, but use it to fund local organizations. Even in conflict countries, there are some incredible people who come together to feed children or set up informal schools. And rather than us setting up these things ourselves, all they really need is to get some support from people who want to help by funding their work rather than doing it ourselves. We already do a huge portion of our work with local partner organizations, but one of the things I'm working on this year is planning how we move from sometimes delivering work ourselves to trying to do everything by funding local partners so that they end up being the ones who make all the decisions about what should happen. And so, yes, that's a big part of my job, is to imagine the future for War Child. Another huge part of my job is to raise money. We spend about £20 million a year, and quite a lot of that comes from donations from rich people or companies or United Nations organizations. So part of my job is to network, to go and meet lots of people, to explain what we do, to explain why it's important, which is quite easy when you're talking about why you should stop a child from being a child soldier, and inspiring those people to try and achieve what they want to achieve with their spare money by investing it with us, and convincing them that we will use it well, and that they can be really proud of what they've achieved by funding our work.
So what do you think your biggest achievement is as an individual?
Oh, that's a good question. Honestly, my biggest achievement, I think, well, there's two ways of looking at it. The first way is I've managed to have a career doing the thing that I decided at the age of 19 was the most important thing for me to do. And that is not always guaranteed. Somehow I've managed to be really helpful in this sector. And I've also managed to get married and have children, which also isn't easy when you're moving around a lot from one humanitarian disaster to another. So that, on a personal level, I think is a good achievement. Professionally, I think I've been helpful in some really difficult situations, like during the Rwandan genocide, when 500,000 people were cut to death by other people who were in their community. I ended up running a refugee camp for people who had fled the violence, and actually keeping tens of thousands of people sheltered and fed and protected from all the horrible conflict that was going on. So Rwanda was very intense, but I ended up feeling like we were doing a really good job. And similar projects that I ran during the Angolan Civil War and the Civil War in the Congo. So just being somewhere and seeing that the work that you're doing is actually providing people with the things that they genuinely need to be able to get their life back together and get started again. That's always felt like a pretty good thing to do. The other good things I've done have involved not just providing that emergency stuff, but thinking about how you make it sustainable and how you move it on from a situation where people are dependent from the aid system, which is delivering the food, to a situation where they're completely self-sustainable. And my favorite one of those was in Cambodia, after the Khmer Rouge were kicked out, the United Nations ran a peace process and did some elections, and it looked like the country was really coming back to life. And we were running normal aid projects, but we did a really interesting project where we allowed people to borrow some money to start a small business. And Cambodia had been so underdeveloped that any business you started had probably a great likelihood of success. So families were borrowing $50 and buying some piglets, and then raising them for 6 months and selling them for $60 each and making a massive profit, and then buying some more piglets and doing the same again. It's really quite easy for families to make a lot of progress. And we were doing this, we had 12 little village banks, we called them, and we had about 600 clients. And I looked at that and I thought, that could be huge. That could be really, really interesting if we expanded the project. So we came up with a model where we'd hand over the village banks to a Cambodian team of people. And we raised, I think, $3 million from US aid, the aid department in Washington. And we used that to kind of scale up the model. And then we created it as an independent Cambodian organization. And it's still going. It's like 20 years ago that we started. And I had a look the other day. They now have village banks in 12,500 villages. And they have something unbelievable like 700,000 clients. And they're lending about $300 million a year, which is massive. It's actually the biggest bank in Cambodia that's focused on lending money to the poorest parts of the country. And so when I look back at that, I thought I could have just not had that idea, or I could have had it and then decided it was a bit complicated, so we weren't going to do that. But because the idea got support from the people around me and we went for it, we created this thing. And you know, how many thousands of children have gone to school because their parents have been able to make money by borrowing and investing it? I don't know, can't really calculate that, but I feel good that we created something that's made such an impact in Cambodia.
Wow, that's really inspiring. Honestly, looking at how you can see the future of these communities and thinking of the people and how they can develop, as well as the economy and the places that they live, that's really interesting. I think you need a person who understands the whole picture to be in these positions. I want to
also, yeah, one thing I would say, other thing that I think if you're an aid worker, you need to always remember that what you're doing is about 5% of what needs to be done. The 95% comes from the people who take part in the project. So like even at War Child, we might provide a place where children can come and learn, but it's the families who bring those children and the children who do the learning. Like they're doing all the work. We're just providing a place where they can learn if they want to put the effort in. And even for that village banking program, you know, all we did was make some money available. The people who borrowed the money and created those hundreds of thousands of small rural businesses, they're doing most of the work. And I think aid workers need to be really humble about what their role is. They're held up by the people who they are supposedly helping, who are doing all the work, really.
Wow. So I also wanted to ask you, what is the most challenging aspect of your job?
Oh, that's a great question. And right now, I would say the most challenging part of running my organization is that it's incredibly risky. Like our mission is to go to countries where people are shooting at each other and kind of insert ourselves into that situation and create a safe place for families and children to come. Whenever my phone rings, I wonder, before I look at the screen, I wonder whether it's one of those calls where someone's telling me that something's gone badly wrong and we have to evacuate people or get someone off to some medical center. But the biggest risk is making sure that the children really are safe. Like we have, we know in the UK, all the safeguarding rules that you have to have in place when you set up a school. And it's so important that every single person who works for our organization has proper training in how to keep children safe, how to recognize when a child is being abused by a peer or by members of their family, or the worst thing that could possibly happen is that they might be abused by someone who actually works for the organization. That's the nightmare situation that I spend an awful lot of time thinking about, and we spend a huge amount of resource doing everything we can to avoid. So the most challenging part of the job is that we choose to do some very difficult things, and we have to then cope with the stress of being constantly aware that something could go wrong, and making sure that our systems are good enough to reduce the chance of something going wrong to the absolute minimum. And I guess the longer I've been in aid work and the more responsibility I've got and the more senior I've got, what I've noticed is that the more it's been, my capacity to live with stress has increased. It's kind of like it's a muscle that you can train. And so in my life, I'm definitely carrying more risk than I was when I was just answering the letters at the Red Cross office. But I've deliberately built in ways of coping with stress that mean I can balance it out. So I always try and go out for a walk in lockdown. I always hang out with my family, who are hilariously funny. And I always try and, you know, if there's something interesting on the telly, I try and watch it because it gets my mind into a different space where I can get rid of the stress that comes with the job.
Right. So based on that, what tips do you have for the people who want to go into aid working, apart from balance, as I can see?
Well, let's see. Tips for going into aid work or any other kind of work is, if you are lucky enough to know what it is that you really want to do, if you've seen something that's really inspired you, then my biggest tip is to remember what that feels like. And to be honest, there have been times in my career where I have come to a bit of a crossroads and I've been thinking, well, what should I do next? I could go and make a lot of money by taking a different kind of job, or I could stay doing what I'm doing. And I've always told myself to try and remember what it felt like when I was 19 and what the idea was, and remember how certain I was that this was the right thing to do. And so far, that's never really failed me. But if you want to get into aid work, it's not one of those careers where you can just sign an application form and send it to an employer with some kind of graduate entry scheme. You have to find your way in, and that requires a certain amount of determination and an ability to cope with an awful lot of emails that will say things like, oh, your CV looks amazing, but we haven't got anything on offer at the moment. Just be resilient, be sure that that's what you want to do, and then be absolutely sure that if that's what you really want to do and you keep trying, it will totally work out. And actually, when I was 19, I knew I wanted to do it, but I wasn't sure that I could actually get in. But now that I'm 56, if I look back, I'm thinking, well, yeah, obviously, if you were determined to do that kind of work and you were writing so many letters, you were definitely going to get in. The perspective that I have now is, if there's something you really want to do, you will definitely be able to do it.
That's really helpful. Resilience is key, I guess.
Yeah.
Is there something that you think will help students my age make this process easier? Maybe some work experience that you suggest, or some books that you could read?
Oh yeah, well, for my particular sector, there's one book that everyone should read. It's called The Bottom Billion, and it's written by a guy called Paul Collier, and it explains why there are poor people in the world and the systems around them that make it very hard for them to break out from that poverty cycle, and how the world is arranged in such a way that it works fantastically well for most of us, but spectacularly badly for some of us. And if you read that one book by Paul Collier, it will tell you most of what you need to know about how the world works and doesn't work properly. The other piece of advice I would say is, it's always when we get an application for someone who wants to come and work for us, some of them might have done a master's degree in something like conflict studies or international development. Some of them might even have done 2 master's degrees, but it's the people who've actually been able to do practical work who really stand out. So if I have someone who's got a choice of, shall I go and do this master's, or shall I take an opportunity to go and volunteer on a project for a year, I would say there's no question, go and do that volunteer work, because you will learn more than you learn in your master's. You'll have a lot more fun, it'll be cheaper, and it looks so much better on your CV.
This has been incredibly insightful. A lot of advice that you've given us here, but if you think there's anything else to add, go ahead.
I think I was lucky that I knew from the age of 19 what I really wanted to do. And I know that that doesn't always happen at that age, but I think it does happen eventually to almost everyone. And so I would say, if you don't know what it is, if it hasn't made itself apparent to you by the age of 19 what you really want to do, then it's still worth going to university. Like, a basic degree is a fabulous thing to have. So just keep going and try and do as many different experiences as you can, because what you really want to do is probably hidden somewhere in a volunteer project, or it's hidden on the trip to North Africa that you might do in your holidays. Just have as many experiences as you can until one of them becomes an experience that you can't forget. Then you know that's what you want to do.
Thank you for listening to today's Career Discovery session. I hope that the stories shared with us by Rob Williams have taught you not only about the jobs available in aid working, but also have inspired you about what we can do together. We hope to see you next week when we will be talking to another specialist in a completely different field, and we hope that you learn something from that session too. See you next week.